now at an instrument developed through a collaboration between the European Consortium and the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, that is the mid-infrared instrument, that's MIRI. It provides coverage in a mid-infrared wavelength, that is much longer ones, and imaging can be obtained through 9 broadband filters. It also has a spectroscopic mode, which allows at low spectral resolution, though, but provides also a slit and a non-slit capacity of imaging. Then the third instrument, which is non-Canadian, I'll move to the Canadian instruments afterwards, but is the near-infrared spectrograph. Very versatile spectroscopic instrument, so it breaks the light into multiple wavelengths and operates in the visible 0.6 to 5.3 microns. It has a very high throughput, that's a very efficiency, especially for single object spectroscopy, but it uses fixed slits. Again, it's a very complex instrument with many modes to be looking. It was built in collaboration with Airbus Industry and also detector subsystem by NASA. So these are the 3 international instruments. Let's now take a look at the Canadian contribution. So again, it's not out of a vacuum. We built on our past success. Canada, it may not be known, but Canada provided the fine error sensor on the FUSE mission back in 1999 and demonstrated then its capacity to deliver a key instrument to James Webb. Also, early Canadian scientists were involved in a then name. It was called the Next Generation Space Telescope, not yet Webb, such as Professor Simon Lilly of the University of Toronto, which is to this day still a member of the Science Working Group, and also people like John Hutchings, which is became the FGS instrument PI. They were able to convince NASA to let Canada deliver this critical component. Also, there was a D-scope, so that's the FGS. We'll take a look again in more detail. And also there was a D-scope of what was then a Fabry-Perot tunable filter interferometer that the US wanted to do, but they actually D-scope, and some Canadian scientists seized the opportunity, René Douin namely, to raise to the challenge to use the mass and volume margin that was now made available by the D-scope instrument to propose a Canadian science instrument. They worked really hard, and the concept evolved over time, actually now deriving to the NIRISS concept. So it's only in 1996 that the international collaboration between NASA, the European Space Agency, and the CSA finally materialized. So they are functionally independent, that is the FGS and the NIRISS, we'll take a look, but they were packaged as a single unit. Their combined dimension is roughly, as you see, a cubic meter, essentially a dishwasher size with a mass of about 80 kilograms. Make you a very expensive and complex dishwasher. The FINES guidance sensor is a critical component of the proper functioning of James Webb as a whole. So for me, it's amazing that even NASA let us do such thing that's on the critical path. Every single observation that's being performed on James Webb need the help and the support of the FINES guidance sensor. So the primary purpose was to ensure pointing stability, but you can break it down into 3 areas. So number 1, provide a whole field image to help find the area of the skies that need to be targeted. That is to determine the position of the spacecraft in space. Element number 2, serve to identify the targeted area using a catalog guide star. So it focuses on a guide star. Once identified, then it helps maintain the guide star in a very tight portion of the sky. So blockades and track a celestial target. Element number 3, it provides the satellite attitude control system with precise information to maintain the pointing accuracy, again, the 1 arc second, but 16 times per second doing so. So it remains steadily with very high precision on a specific target. So FGS is, again, a fairly not so complex, but an instrument with a primary mirror, 3 mirror assembly to collimate the light. For those that know this, the detector or are interested by this, it's a Mercurian Telluride detector. It's about 4 megapixels, also closely visible to near infrared range. It was built by Honeywell Canada, which was formerly known as Condev. Now moving to the science instrument, which is the NIRISS, so the near infrared imager and Slitless spectrograph. It provides unique observation capability between, again, 0.6 and 5 micron that complements those available with the previous instrument, the NIRCam and NIRSPEC. It's a very high efficiently all reflective design. There's no, there's only mirror surfaces. There's no lenses. It's provide a wide field imaging, a spectroscopic. So it's a very complex instrument with multiple modes of operation. using state-of-the-art grating prism combine, or so-called GRISMs, for spectroscopy, either at low resolution over a wide field, it's as much as 2 arc minutes by 2 arc minutes, to a medium resolution GRISM spectroscopy, which is optimized for application requiring extreme spectroscopic stability. It also has a set of filters that allows it to match those of NIRCam. So again, it's a 4 megapixel camera with a mercury cadmium telluride detector. So what was shown on the right is one of the things you can deliver with the system because of its precision. It enables measurement of the relative brightness of the solar occultation. In this case, it's the WASP 96 BB is, I think, is the star. The planet in WASP 96 is the star. Allows to reveal the presence, in this case, of what is a hot giant, gas giant exoplanet that's orbiting the star. So NIRISS was a contribution of, well, of course, the CSA, but also Honeywell International. It was also led by René Doyon, Université de Montréal, with also technical support from the National Research Council. So why doing this? Obviously, there's some industrial benefits, but most important, in my opinion, is the system is now functioning, fully operating. But it enables, these technological contributions enable the Canadian astronomers to gain access to the amazing science that will be delivered by the web. So there's a variety of access that's being given. There's the only non-competent one is the guaranteed time observation, which is giving to the scientists that help develop the primary instrument. So Canada gets 2 times 200 hours to this program. Also, Canadians have been fairly successful in competing in the case of the early release science. So that's not the early release observations, it's the early release sciences, with 1 Canadian co-PI being selected, but other Canadian collaborators having been selected. What's critical is the success that Canadians have had in the General Observer programs, or the GEO program. This was the first call, and you see that 14 Canadian-led proposals have been selected, and more than 70 Canadian researchers are actually collaborating on this. Overall, it's 5% of all of the web observing time that's on average will be dedicated to Canada for its contribution. It may sound as a low number, but if you make the fraction of how much we invested to actually how much the whole system costed, it's very efficient. Okay, now we're moving to the science. And some of the science objective. This one is on the early universe. So it's an amazing science that's unveiled because, well, James Webb is such a formidable time machine with unprecedented light collecting capacity and also the capacity to look very distant in the early universe. It's the part of the reason James Webb was designed to observe in the infrared is explained by the essentially by the redshift that we are observing in the light. That is, the light is being emitted by distant stars and galaxies, and because of the expansion of the universe, essentially the expansion expands the light also as it reaches us. Wavelength shifts then from the visible light, if they were emitted then to the infrared lights as we see it. So ultimately, James Webb is tailor-made to be a time machine, allowing to purse and look into the early universe. What I'm going to show next is one of the early release observations that demonstrate this capacity with a deep field. That most of you might have seen the image already. This is a massive galaxy cluster. You've got the number identified there, and it's so massive, and the location it has, it acts as a strong gravitational lens that bends the light that's coming further from it, and essentially bends the lights toward us. It kind of acts as a magnifying glasses, allowing to see very distantly in the background. So that was already identified in previous surveys, for example, through Hubble. But what you see in there is just amazing depth of the field, the curvature of the gravitational lens. It's just a beautiful image into itself. There's a lot of spectroscopy that can be done with this image, and a lot of information that can be inferred. Okay, another element of the science objective is galactic evolutions. So it's an important science objective. It's to study how they evolve and how the matter in the universe essentially is organized on the large scales. It helps to understand the nature and the history of the universe. We need to study so that we understand how matter organized and how it changed over a long period of time at different scales. A question can include, how and when did the first galaxy form? How did we end up with the large variety of galaxies that we see today? Also implies that we need a better understanding of the galactic structures and the impact of what massive black holes that many of the galaxies have in their center. Galaxies are still merging and forming as we speak to this day. For example, our own local galactic neighborhood with the Andromeda galaxy, which is heading towards our own Milky Way. Of course, you know, that's not to worry. The impact is only billions of years from now. So what I've shown here also is another early release observation. It's the Stephan's Quintet, so-called, because there's 5 galaxies. NGC 7318 has 2 of them that are essentially merging. A large collection of massive galaxies. One is merging. Another one, NGC 7319, has a very active galactic nucleus, rotating, also jet of gas that emits a lot of radio wavelengths. It's a very complex environment that really well demonstrates the ability of Webb to be able to look and to image galactic mergers. Just to notice that's the 7320, that is the one on the side, is much closer to us. It just coincidentally happens to be in the field of view, but it's not actually merging to the other galaxies. Third science objective is stellar life cycle. Stellar astronomy has been there for a long time. It's quite interesting, but understanding stellar birth and the early evolution of stars is much newer. That telescope used to peer deep into the dense and dust-rich environments need to be able to observe in non-traditional wavelengths. The visible light is essentially, the dust is essentially opaque to the visible light. And infrared as a capacity is not as diffracted as capacity to penetrate much deeper. So young star formation, such as this Carina Nebula, has very complex interactions between the stars and the interstellar medium. The details of how the star evolve and how they release some heavy elements that then get recycled into new stars that also get born is a very complex environment. This is an early release image again of the Carina Nebula. It shows what's called the eastern edge. It's rotated. There's no up and down in space, but this is rotated. Typically, you would see that to the east. It's the eastern edge of a much larger ionized bubble, but it's a great zoom. If you've seen the comparison to Hubble, this is much clearer, much nicer view of the same image being taken now by Webb. It's a highly ionizing region, so many of the star emits radiation. Some of the gas gets essentially ionized. They lose their electrons. They're essentially more transparent to light. And in some areas, well, you see the dust-rich being pushed. And in those areas of dust-rich element, maybe I should use the pointer, dust-rich element in here, where you see many stars forming at the same time. So it's a pretty good understanding of star forming. And it really helps for the understanding of stellar evolutions. Okay, that brings us to the last but not least, certainly not least, science objective of Webb, which in my opinion is one of the most exciting objectives, which is the quest for exoplanets. Since the first was observed, we now have thousands of those in our that have been observed, and every sorts of star systems have been listed so far. Lists continue to expand every day. So it's one of the main uses of the James Webb Telescope is to be able to study the atmospheres of those exoplanets. So that's not as common, to search for the building block of life, potentially, if we're lucky, elsewhere in the universe. So primary method by which it's going to observe this, it's the transit method. I've shown you some image of the NIRISS instrument with the transit method. So essentially the planet orbits around the star light gets dimmer, and essentially by characterizing the difference in the imagery with and without the planet, you can infer some elements having to do with the composition of the exoplanet atmosphere. So it's a primary method. It requires a pretty good, essentially, dimming of the star itself. So some method they use called coronagraphy that enables direct imaging of an exoplanet. This is what we see here. It's not one of the early release. It's a very recent release. It's the first exoplanet image by Webb. It's HIP 65426 for those that know. It's planet B. It's about 7 times the mass of Jupiter. It's very far from its sun. And it's a very young planet also, millions of years and not billions of years, if I understand correctly. So very interesting. So these are actually, you know, the image of an exoplanet, which is incredible. Finally, it's also important to understand that yes, other worlds also mean studying our own solar system. Obviously, there are ground-based, other telescopes. There's even missions that are being sent to those distant worlds in our solar system. But data was at different wavelength and also from different sources, and an amazing resolution allows us to build a broader, fuller picture of the objects in our own solar system. This is such an impressive image of Jupiter, where you see the auroras, you see the rings, you see diffraction spikes from even some of the planets or of the moons orbiting Jupiter. I think I'm speechless to see this amazing image. Hopefully you have appreciated it as much as I did. So we're getting to the end of the talk. I'm just going to cover a bit more. Obviously, Webb is amazing. As I said, it's our flagship, but it's not our only space telescope. Currently, we have contributions, not necessarily leadership, but contributions. For example, on top right, it's the AstroSat, which is India's first astronomy satellite dedicated to studying hot, high-energy objects in the universe, like young stars and black holes. So we did contribute detectors to this mission, to a detector that's ultraviolet imaging telescope. It's called UVIT. And thanks to the contribution to this science instrument, we now have ability to compete for observing time on AstroSat, and we do that. We have calls systematically where we get Canadian scientists that can observe. They can access the multiple wavelength from the observatory. There's X-ray, visible light, etc. The main mission was to observe high energy activities in star system, etc. It's again fairly complex set of capacity. Then we can move to it's not the involvement of the CSA is not so large in this one, but it's an impressive industry and academia-based system, which is the Bright constellation on the top left. It's the first space astronomy missions to be carried with nanosats. It's still in operation to this day. Remind you, it's been launched in 2013. Not all the satellites function. There were 6 initially. Only a few now remains. But it had the goal to learn more about the structure and evolution of the brightest stars. So obviously, the light collecting capacity is not that great. But for the brightest stars, they could look at, for example, precursors to supernova explosion. Canada was more than a partner in Bright. Actually, they partner also with Austria and Poland. And we did provide support for both the design build and then the operations of the systems to this day. Finally, the trio is completed, and this one is only Canadian. It's called the NEOSat. It's the world's first space telescope dedicated to detecting and tracking asteroids, comets, and satellites and space debris. So it's kind of a suitcase-sized satellite that can really look very closely to the sun. So you see there's a fairly long baffle at the front of it. And that allows it to look more close to the sun than many other systems. So NEOSat sweeps the sky, observing satellites, space debris, and it's part of our Canada's commitment to keeping space environments safe. Can also reveal the presence of exoplanet, and it's the astronomical link here, around distant stars, again using a principle of looking at the light intensity variation around stars that are due to orbiting exoplanets. So most NEOSat and Bright also were building on the most successful earlier, now decommissioned most instrument. And this is my last slide. So I'm completing my talk on this. It's of course, we have to look to the future. So what is it? We've talked about Webb. It's going to operate for a long time, but let's take a look at the future. And one of the highest priority that the CASCA, the Canadian Astronomical Society, have proposed in the long-range bands is the CASTAR. It's called the Cosmological Advanced Survey Telescope for Optical and Ultraviolet Research, or CASTAR. It's a proposed mission concept that would image the skies, obviously in the ultraviolet, as a blue optical wavelengths. In a certain sense, it can be felt as an actual successor to Hubble. It's developed in collaboration with NRC CASTAR, will be operating close to the diffraction limit. It's a 1 meter size aperture telescope, so much smaller than Hubble, but the developing technology and detector capacity makes it still, they would cover a much larger field of view, about 100 times larger than Hubble can actually do. If funded, CASTAR would be the very first Canadian-led large space astronomy mission. Currently, there's both a feasibility study and technology development that are being supported by the CSA at this time. Also identified in the long-range plan, Canada is positioned to maintain its world leadership in studies of cosmic microwave background. So the CMB, there's substantial participation in either or both the CMB-S4, which is a ground-based facility. And what is shown here is the JAXA, that is the Japanese Space Agency-led Lightbird mission in space. They target the cosmic microwave background in a very complex way. I think I won't even try to get to explain. I would be out of my depth here, but it allows to fully exploit the relic radiation from the Big Bang, to understand the origin and the history of the current universe. So there's a key Canadian technology at the heart of Lightbird, which has also potential spin-off for quantum computing even. We support, again, technology and concept studies from this area. And last, but much smaller, is the RASC. It's a fairly large mission. It's an approved medium-class European Space Agency mission. Again, a 1-meter telescope, but it's designed to obtain precise transmission spectroscopy for a large number of transiting exoplanets. So Canada would not necessarily contribute a significant portion of it, but we are considering a small contribution that would enable Canadian scientists to be part of the RASC consortium and have priority access to the data. These are not the only concepts we're looking into for the future. There are some other listed down below. They cover a large variety of observatory type and their observatory size. None of these concepts have been secured yet, but they're being fostered because what we want is to ensure that Canada can continue to strive for a bright future in space astronomy. So with that, I think I'm on time and hopefully stirred some interest, and we'll be gladly taking some questions to the extent that I can answer them.
Well, thank you, Martin. Seeing if we'll get a little bit of audio. I'm not sure if you can hear me here. Ed, go ahead.
Can you hear us here? Can you hear us, Martin?
Yeah, very well. Hopefully it wasn't so bad at my end too when I spoke. So.
Okay, yeah, no, it was excellent. We could hear you well. Okay, so you said, Scott, there's a question?
Yeah, there's a couple of questions here. One is about the orbit of Webb and the halo orbit, and if they could explain, if Martin could explain a little bit about the orbit and how it stays in the halo orbit.
Did you hear that, Martin?
Yes, but I'd love to be able to show the video because it's such a great, let me try again to share my screen. I'm going to do this because the video is such much better than I could even try to show you the exact orbit. It's not a very stable orbit, mind you. So will it stop? Will it? Of course, it worked when I tried it at home. Obviously, no, it's not. Or maybe I just have to be patient. Another way to show you the video would be, so give me a second. I think it's worth the wait. It's worth the wait. So that's not. Okay. So you should see the presentation. Now I should be able to go in the deck itself, and that should be now running. Okay. Maybe I won't succeed. I'm trying too hard. Something too complicated. Okay. So you see where Webb orbits around L2 in a circular orbit. It's a fairly stable orbit because it's around L2 and there's a compensation of both the orbital mechanics and the gravity of the Earth and the Sun combined. So it doesn't require a lot of fuel to maintain. What's really interesting, and I'll start it again so you can see it again, is that this really enables the sun shield to be always pointing more or less towards the Earth and the Sun. So it serves to baffle both of those. So if the question was asking me what is the orbital mechanics that allow this to, I just don't have the answer to that. But this video shows a pretty well the complex orbit. First, It orbits around the full year. And of course, Webb cannot observe everywhere at any time. It has a specific observation locations depending on when it is in the yearly cycle and its geometry to the Earth, the Sun, and the rest of the universe.
Okay, great. And there is another question here about the image of Jupiter. And there was something labeled Io's footprint. And the question was, what is Io's footprint?
Yes. Okay, I'll show it again. Again, I'll share the screen. Let me go back to presentation mode. Just a second, because it's such a great picture. Let's take a look again. Yeah. Okay. And hopefully I know the answer, but share mode. Okay, and share again. Okay. So yeah, that's pretty good questions for the Io's footprint. I certainly understand the spike here in the diffraction spike because Io is out of the picture. So it's not to be seen here. But that's a pretty good question. I admit I don't know. It's a good one. Can I take a rain check on this one?
It must be maybe the shadow.
Oops. Oh yes, yeah, that must be it. Yeah, it's
somebody's listening online back there.
Exactly. It's got to be that's the point. If the footprint, it must be the shadow. Yeah. But I admit that it's barely visible. It's I would have to zoom. I think I see it at my screen, but there's no way you can see it at yours.
Okay.
Yeah, but that's what it must be. It's the projection of the
questions.
Does anybody in the room here have questions for Martin?
I have a question. This is really naive, but why a slitless spectrograph?
Okay, so yeah, there's many ways to split the light. Okay, and there's many ways. Of course, the most ancient one is the Newton's way, where you use a prism. So you use a prism at different diffraction index depending on the wavelength of the light. Light gets curved differently as it enters the prism, and it separates. The white light enters in, and you get a different set of lights going out. Many of the spectrometers have been using a method essentially which use it's called a diffraction grating. So the light gets on the top and the light gets separated. To use that, you need a slit. So otherwise your image gets blurred. So essentially the slit allows you to remove the unwanted light on your detector. So in one dimension, you have the wavelength, and the other dimension, you have your imagery. You have to construct the imagery taking over image. In the case of the NIRISS, it doesn't need to use a slit. It uses the next generation of system, and there's many ways to build this. There's even interferometers use other ways also, but in their case, they use a combination of a prism and a grating, which is called a grism. So essentially, light gets separated, and they don't need a slit. Maybe my explanation is pretty not so good. I would need a diagram to give a better explanation, but that's the best I did.
Yeah, we have some more online questions here, Martin. Let's see. Ron McNaughton asks, the total Webb cost was way over its initial budget. Did Canada have to pay part of those extra costs, or did we do what we budgeted for?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, which I know. Of course, I cater more to the program aspects of Webb than its technology or its science, but no, indeed, what was the idea of a national contributions to a space program is Canada commits to delivering this, and sometimes whatever the cost. So it depends on the arrangement. In the case of NIRISS and FGS, once we committed and deliver on those, and which we did, yes, there were some overruns even in Canada, but nowhere near the significant overruns that we saw for James Webb overall. So in the end, ultimately, things that drive the cost overruns is duration in time, and Webb has launch has been postponed and postponed and postponed. So we had to hit some of the extra costs due to that, but not in a ratio of cost increase that we saw for Webb overall. So if you make a calculation, we expended $200 million roughly on a program that's now way above 10 billion overall. So I think getting 5% of observing time for such a small contribution is very significant. It's not to the initial ratio. I think we did better. We did better there in managing the budget.
I have a bunch of online questions, but if you want to, if there are other room questions.
Any other questions in the room here before we go to online?
Okay, Graham W. asks, is L2 the first time this has been used in space exploration?
No, not at all. It's getting busy, exaggerating. There's a WMAP that was there. There's Planck that's still there. It's a really sweet spot for infrared observatory for the same reason that for Webb. It allows to shield both the Earth and the Sun. It's also stable, or orbital mechanics is also stable. That's not so bad for dust, maybe an issue, but not so bad than other areas. So Webb experienced some first issue with the micrometeorites. It's part of the challenge of being out there in space, unprotected by the Earth's radiation shield. Which you get in low Earth orbit, but the orbit is much better.
And that's actually the next question. Randy Atwood from Mississauga asked if you could provide any information on the micrometeoroid danger and how the one hit has affected its performance.
Not much. I can tell you that it has not affected much its performances. I saw some, not directly, but some of the engineers working with us saw some of the early results. And actually, at this point, it's not a concern at all. The question is, do we understand the statistics of micrometeorites impacts at that location with respect to size and frequency of micrometeorites? And that's what's not as well known. So is this a one-hit wonder? Of course, something that happens will not necessarily repeat itself. So far, so good. And no, it has not significantly injured the spacecraft at all. There will be options if it comes to that point of steering maybe the spacecraft in some other direction, but it's not considered. These would be mitigation methods in case the problems endures.
Michelle?
Yeah, I'd like to know what the sky coverage is of the James Webb Telescope, if it varies over the year.
Sky coverage, you means over its lifetime, or you mean the field of view?
Like the full sphere, the celestial sphere.
Yeah, I'm having a hard time just even hearing.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
I can repeat the question. So, how much of the celestial sphere can the telescope image, essentially, and does that vary throughout the year?
Yeah, it does. As you saw with the orbital mechanics, of course, it's always in pointing away from the Earth-Sun ray. So essentially, it's always pointing away. Of course, it can look into the half hemisphere fairly well, and perhaps even beyond some of it. But because it's always pointing in this way, it's not pointing in all directions all at once. So it does vary throughout the year. It's the ability to image portion of the sky.
Okay, we have a couple more online questions. Robert Rorat asks, how many stars can be analyzed, processed at the same time for the existence of exoplanets?
That's a cool question. I don't have the answer to that. Finding an exoplanet is much more difficult than characterizing it, in a sense, once you know where it is. To find an exoplanet, you have to happen to be witnessing the transit. And for that, you need to guess, okay, where is the transit, where it is. Some other missions might be a bit better to find exoplanets. But once you've found them, knowing when the transit will be, then you can target Webb, you can image it, and then you can look at its atmosphere. So that's where it's quite powerful. There are statistical methods to look at the data to find them by chance, but it's not the most efficient method. Webb time is going to be very precious. So when you bid and you say, I want to observe this, it's not going to be looking for a chance event. It's going to be, you need to know the science. You need to know that this planet is going to transit, and you want to characterize it, and you have good reasons for it. So I think that's going to drive what actually Webb can look at.
Judy?
There's massive amounts of data coming from all of the imaging that is done. Where and how is it stored and accessed?
So there's the there's the SCS-TI, so there's a Science Telescope Institute, which is located in Baltimore, which has got the responsibility for NASA to both operate and to essentially is the Science Operations Center. Most of the data will be stored. I don't know where physically it is with the cloud services now, but essentially they're catering to most of that. In Canada, the National Research Center, the Edsberg Institute, has a Canadian astronomical data center, which is dedicated to capture the data and the observations that we will have with Webb to make sure that we store at least the Canadian portion of the data that we receive. There are all the other repositories, also secondary repositories a bit all over the place. For example, some of the NIRISS team and the FGS team may get access to some of the data for their own purpose.
And we have one more online question here. Ed Radford asks, what happens to Webb and other L2 satellites when they are decommissioned?
I think they stay there. They stay there for as long as they stay there. It's not that stable. So ultimately they wander away. So I don't know how long it takes, but ultimately they don't stay there. It actually takes some effort to stay in L2. It's not as stable as some of the other Lagrangian points where this may be an issue, but L2 to me. But I don't know if it's years, tens of years. I don't know. I know for low Earth orbit, because we're mandated by law when we put systems in low Earth orbit, we need to be able to decommission them within, I believe it's 25 years or something of that sort. But there's the Earth atmosphere that helps cooling them down. Essentially, they come back and they burn on the reentry. For L2, there's nothing like this. It's out there and it stays there. I admit I don't know if they're going to take a fuel reserve to bring it back, but I doubt it sincerely.
Okay.
Hi, Martin. It's Ed right here. I have a question. It's kind of an engineering question. I was wondering about the fine guidance sensor, I think is what you called it. So what I would understand is that actually helps guide it to where it's trying to point to target a particular object. How does the telescope move? Like, does some component of the telescope move, or does the whole telescope move, or does the whole vehicle move?
So it's not a steered telescope, a gimbal in a way that you would have, let's say, on a ground-based observatory. It's the old spacecraft that has to move. So you got gyroscopes that allows to steer it slow, gently, essentially keep it in position. So the FGS provides the information that the old platform need to use to stay locked in the pointing position. So that's how it works, essentially. But it's gyroscopic effects that are doing it.
Quick question: can an individual get time on the James Webb Telescope?
Everyone it's open for everyone to bid. I'm not sure you're not going to get funded. To be funded, at least to get the Canadian Space Agency financial support, if you get observing time, you need to be associated with an academic institution. So that's one of the conditions. Could be a student, could be, of course, a professor of some sort. To get observing time, what you need is a good proposal. So I did not submit, so I don't know for sure. But if you have a good proposal, you have a good proposal. It's a double-blind peer review. That is, no one know who submits, no one know the name, no one know if it's a man, a woman. It's double-blind. It's essentially they look at the text, and if you have a great text and a good idea, and the community that evaluates it thinks it's the thing to do with the precious hours of Webb, you get time. Now what you do and what you do with the imagery after that, and what software you use, etc. But we got, surprisingly, in this call, because of the double-blind procedure, we got a fairly high number of postdoctoral students, and even PhDs that got time on Webb. So in Canada, so typically we almost get no one to get time at those level of tuition. But in case of Webb, because of the double-blind, we got new entrants into the field of astronomy that were able to have pretty good pitch and get selected.
Okay, no, that's it. Wrap.
So Martin, just on behalf of the RASC Winnipeg Center and the RASC Mississauga Center, we just want to say thank you very much. That was an excellent presentation and on Canada's contributions and where the science is going with the James Webb Space Telescope. And again, thank you very much on behalf of everybody. And I just want to say to a few other people, thank you for tonight. Ed and Scott here at Winnipeg Center worked hard together to put this together. And then Randy Atwood at the Mississauga Center as well. So if everyone could just, as best you can, please a round of applause for people.
Thank you, everyone. Good evening.
And again, there, thank you very much, Martin. And we wish you all the best in your role at the CSA. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It was a pleasure. Merci. Bonne soirée à tous.
We'll be signing off to the Zoom in just a moment. I just want you to Winnipeg Center folks. We're going to take a 15-minute break. So at approximately 20 to 9, we will start up again. Please sign back in again to remind everyone that it is our we have bylaws to vote on tonight, as well as our regular meeting information and a few presentations that we're doing tonight. Again, Mississauga Center, have a great night and thank you for joining us. Good night.